Today I'm going to talk about a novel model of divergent perception in imagery extremes. I'm first going to motivate the need for a new model of divergent perception, take you through the model itself, and then use it to predict behavior and brain activity in future studies. First, why do some people have divergent perceptual experiences? One of the most striking examples of divergent perception is complex hallucinations, like seeing realistic animals and people. These are uncontrolled, perceived externally, and are often disturbing. Another well-known form of divergent perception is synesthesia. This is the uncontrolled association between two divergent sensations or experiences. One of the most popular examples is grapheme color synesthesia, which is the example here, where people experience colors with different alphanumeric characters. Synesthesia can be perceived externally, or it can be experienced internally, like a strong association or imagery. This is often reported as an enjoyable experience. And recently, my collaborators and I have been investigating mental projection, which we call prophantasia. This is the ability to project mental images into the real world. For example, some people can easily imagine how a painting would look like or fit on their wall, with highly precise imagined size and colors. This is a controlled experience, it's perceived externally, and it's often enjoyable. I hypothesize that different kinds of people will have these different divergent experiences, and I think the key lies in individual differences in mental imagery ability. But the relationship is probably not what you'd expect. We now know that there is a spectrum of visual mental imagery ability, from the complete absence of a mind's eye to imagery that is as vivid and effortless as real perception. The extreme ends of the spectrum are called aphantasia and hyperphantasia, and those extremes are where I'm going to focus my model. The results of several studies have culminated in the idea that people with imagery, especially extremely vivid imagery, have a certain profile of divergent experiences compared to people with aphantasia. Someone with vivid imagery is thought to have more divergent sensory sensitivities, that is, enhanced hyper and hyposensitivity to visual stimulation and stimulation in other senses. They're thought to have enhanced proneness to pseudo-hallucinations and be more likely to have synesthesia and schizophrenia symptoms, especially positive symptoms like magical ideation, delusions, and hallucinations. And also they're thought to be more prone to mental projection. If the explanation is that simple, that mental imagery contributes to all of these perceptual divergences, there should be a lack of these things in aphantasia, right? I'll take you through some of the evidence that actually suggests a more complex story and show that these two groups are actually, in many cases, very similar to each other in their profiles of divergent perception. So first, in terms of divergent sensory sensitivity, I'd like to thank Carla Dance for sharing her data on this, and she's going to present some of these results in more detail later. But all you need to know for now is that she gave individuals with imagery and aphantasia a questionnaire that assessed sensory hyper and hyposensitivity. What she found was both stronger hypersensitivity and hyposensitivity in people with imagery compared to people with aphantasia. The only thing I did differently was split the imagery group into two groups, the typical imagery group and those with hyperphantasia. And what you see is not the pattern you would expect if sensory sensitivity is linearly related to imagery vividness. So in terms of extremely vivid imagery boosting sensory sensitivities generally, the evidence is not there. Looking at the correlation between ratings of sensory hyper and hyposensitivity within the imagery group, you can see there's virtually no correlation, and in fact there's moderate evidence for no relationship when Bayes factors are calculated. So increased imagery vividness does not seem to boost hyper or hyposensitivity. However, if you look at the difference scores between hyper and hyposensitivity ratings, you see the largest variance among the people with hyperphantasia, highlighted in purple. So what is going on here? Why is it that more moderate imagery individuals show similar levels of hyper and hyposensitivities, but not people with hyperphantasia? I suspect that there are actually different kinds of people with hyperphantasia contributing to these data, and pooling them into a single group masks meaningful differences. Interestingly, as with the people with hyperphantasia, it seems that if someone with aphantasia reports hypersensitivities, they will be more likely to report lower hyposensitivity, and vice versa. And again, individuals more in the middle in terms of imagery vividness seem to be more consistent with their ratings for both hyper and hyposensitivity. To test this, I took the absolute value of hyper minus hyposensitivity score and first compared the variance in scores between people with aphantasia and people with typical imagery. People with aphantasia showed extremely strong evidence for a larger variance in these scores. And this only increased if I removed less extreme people with aphantasia from this group. I also found extremely strong evidence for a difference in variance between people with hyperphantasia and typical imagery. This supports my hypothesis that there may actually be subgroups with different profiles of sensory sensitivities within each of the imagery extremes. Next, in terms of pseudo-hallucinations, the hypothesis is that individuals with hyperphantasia will show the highest proneness to pseudo-hallucinations, and people with aphantasia will show the lowest. I'll go into how we can induce pseudo-hallucinations a little later on, but here's what you need to know for now. In the first column, we have imagery vividness ratings from 0 to 10. 0 is complete aphantasia, and 10 is hyperphantasia. PHY is the proportion of individuals in our sample who reported pseudo-hallucinations, and PHN is those who didn't. I developed an experience that elicits pseudo-hallucinations in at least 81% of people. This number is actually skewed lower by individuals with aphantasia, as they made up a large proportion of our sample, but let's set a conservative general population proportion at 81%. People with complete aphantasia show a lower than average proneness to pseudo-hallucinations, about 50-50 as you would expect. Unexpectedly, however, people with hyperphantasia also show lower than average proneness to pseudo-hallucinations. And you can see that higher than average proneness comes from individuals with more moderate imagery vividness. Again, this demonstrates the hypothesized linear relationship between imagery vividness and divergent perceptual experience is not backed up by the evidence. As an important note, of the people with aphantasia who experienced pseudo-hallucinations, only about 3% of them interpreted their experiences as complex real-world objects. The remaining 97% experienced geometric patterns and illusory colors. Over 30% of people with hyperphantasia, on the other hand, saw complex visuals, and there is a reason for that according to the model I will present later on. Next, there is some evidence that vivid imagery is associated with schizophrenia symptoms, particularly positive symptoms like hallucinations and delusions. Now, there is no published research on the prevalence of schizophrenia symptoms in aphantasia, but I conducted a pilot survey with the help of the Aphantasia Network, and the data I'm presenting here are a subset from those who reported experiencing either positive or negative symptoms of schizophrenia. First, there were generally more reports of positive symptoms than negative symptoms. In our hyperphantasia sample, 17 out of 20 who reported symptoms of some kind reported positive symptoms. Interestingly, of the people with aphantasia who experienced symptoms, 64% of those reported positive symptoms, and more so than negative symptoms. Also interesting is the fact that a similar proportion of people with hyperphantasia and aphantasia reported symptoms of schizophrenia of some kind. This is compared to our total sample, which included those that did not report any symptoms. So these are not the results of a rigorous test, but there's not even a hint that vivid imagery has anything to do with experiencing schizophrenia symptoms. Particularly, it does not seem to be related to a higher prevalence of these symptoms. And finally, mental projection. To note, this is the only controlled aspect of divergent perception that's considered in this presentation, and at least here, we find very clear differences between people with aphantasia and hyperphantasia. In brief, the task required participants to project an imagined red five-pointed star onto a black rectangle shown on a computer screen. After attempting to project the star onto the screen, participants rated the vividness of their projection on a 1 to 6 scale by comparing their projection to one of the images shown here. All you need to know here is that about 90% of people with aphantasia, or low imagery shown in the green and blue dots, did not see any mental projection at all. A few of them were able to report a very faint outline of a star, but this is nothing compared to what you can see in the purple dots, which is the typical imagery group. Whereas people with hyperphantasia, shown in orange, tend to report more defined and realistic projections, about 75% of them. Either that or nothing at all, again showing this binary in terms of the extreme imagery groups. So in summary, people with aphantasia show similar variability in sensory sensitivities compared to people with hyperphantasia. Both people with hyperphantasia and aphantasia actually show lower proneness to pseudo-hallucinations compared to more average imagery, also suggesting more variability within these groups. Carla Dance has already shown in another paper that people with aphantasia can experience synesthesia, even projector-type synesthesia. And although schizophrenia symptoms have not been investigated in a published sample, my own pilot data suggest no difference in positive or negative schizophrenia symptoms between people with aphantasia or hyperphantasia. People with aphantasia seem to show similar patterns to people with hyperphantasia in terms of pretty much all aspects of divergent perception that have been investigated so far, with the exception of mental projection, which is under voluntary control. This seems confusing and contradictory to current theories of divergent perception, but I propose a new theory moving forward that I think can better explain and hopefully predict results of future studies with greater accuracy than what we're currently seeing. First, I propose our two imagery extremes form just one dimension of a divergent perceptual spectrum. I hypothesize that mental imagery ability and vividness reflect the strength of an individual's mid-level priors according to a predictive processing framework. So as an interlude, according to predictive processing, we use priors or top-down information to shape our perception of reality. These can be low-level and based on sensory regularities, such as Gestalt grouping, and synesthesia is associated with strong low-level priors. Priors can also be high-level and related to beliefs, such as interpreting a sound as a voice. Strong high-level priors are associated with hallucinations. And then there are mid-level or intermediate-level priors. Anil Seth mentioned these in his theory called predictive perception, using synesthesia as an example. Anil suggested that synesthetic associations are encoded at this intermediate level. However, I'd like to offer an alternative. I believe synesthetic associations occur at a lower sensory level because they're automatic, they emerge via perceptual learning similar to Gestalt principles, and you can't switch it off. Also, people with aphantasia are susceptible to such low-level illusions, and they can also have synesthesia. Whereas imagery is required for high-level illusions, like seeing complex pseudo-hallucinations, while still maintaining reality monitoring ability, which is why I think mid-level priors are consciously interpretative and are best represented by mental imagery ability between low-level and high-level priors. An over-reliance on any of these priors will increase prediction error, and this can lead to divergent perception. But I'm going to focus on mid-level priors because I believe these other levels can be explained by the second dimension of my model, which is sensory precision. So strength of priors is one dimension that contributes to perceptual divergence. But as vision scientists, we know there's not only the top-down contribution to visual experience, but also bottom-up, which is represented on this other axis here. Sensory precision is the extent to which you rely on external sensory information in updating your prior predictions, your confidence in sensory information. Low sensory precision, or low confidence in sensory information, increases reliance on priors, particularly abstract high-level priors that are not dependent on perceptual learning, so beliefs like, what I'm seeing is real. High sensory precision means high confidence in sensory information, so you use that information to update your priors, which results in strong low-level priors as seen in synesthesia. So I think strength of high and low-level priors are both related to sensory precision and can be explained as such. So instead of a model that looks like this, this with 3 different axes, we get this, strength of priors and sensory precision. And we can predict divergent perceptual experiences of individuals at each of the extreme corners of the grid. Hyperphantasia on the top and aphantasia on the bottom. Schizophrenia symptoms on the left. Synesthesia on the right. I hypothesize these 4 corners of the grid will be most predictable in terms of divergent perceptual experiences. This is because someone in the middle, in terms of priors or sensory weighting, can potentially compensate if they're weaker on one dimension or the other. And I'm not suggesting a neat linear pattern or trade-off from synesthesia to schizophrenia symptoms, for example. So I'm going to ignore the space in the middle for now, and that's the model inspired by previous data. But can it be used to predict real behavior and brain activity? For the rest of my talk, I'll provide my behavior and neural predictions for future research based on this model I present here. Specifically, I predict different patterns of brain activity related to individual proneness to complex and simple pseudo-hallucinations, which I believe can be used as a precursor to pathological hallucination proneness. So as you may know from the ECVP demo night or my recent papers, a full field visual flicker can induce the experience of pseudo-hallucinations. This is an extremely reliable phenomenon. Previous studies have explained simple induced hallucinations as being constrained by the physical visual system. For example, seeing the most condensed visual information at the center compared to the periphery. Geometric patterns can also be the product of seeing veins in the eyes, for example, which may therefore have a physical explanation. But there is some mystery surrounding why some people see highly complex pseudo-hallucinations, including real-world objects, people, animals, and even whole environments. There's currently no theory predicting the likelihood that an individual will experience simple or complex hallucinations, the latter of which is a cornerstone of various psychiatric disorders. So I will now provide a hypothesis according to my model. I'm going to take you step by step through the hypothesis. Here you have Gun's flicker, flickering red and black at 7.5 Hz, which means that 7.5 cycles of red and black flicker occur in 1 second. And this can be expressed as a sine wave. So here's the flicker frequency of the Gun's flicker expressed as a sine wave. Here is a brain with the visual cortex highlighted. Previous research has shown that the visual cortex samples information in the environment with a certain frequency, in the range of about 8 to 12 Hz. The visual cortex is also used for imagery, and previous research has found that when people use vivid imagery, the flicker frequency of the visual cortex is lower. And when people are not imagining anything visually, the sampling frequency is higher. So you can see the difference between a brain during imagery and a brain during rest, theoretically speaking. If you compare these internal rhythms to those of Gun's flicker, you can see that the imagining brain has more similar rhythms to Gun's flicker compared to the brain that is not imagining. My hypothesis is that Gun's flicker is interacting with rhythms in visual cortex to elicit pseudo-hallucinations. So if brains are the same and they follow this logic, you should be able to measure higher frequencies in visual cortex prior to observing the Gun's flicker, and lower frequencies that correspond to the experience of pseudo-hallucinations. The problem with this is that brains are not all the same, and there is actually a lot of natural variation in the rhythms that occur in visual cortex. I hypothesize that people with imagery and people with aphantasia have different natural brain rhythms, even when they're not performing any task, and these rhythms will interact with the Gun's flicker differently. Specifically, I hypothesize people with aphantasia will show higher frequency rhythms at rest, and people with imagery will show lower frequency rhythms at rest, more similar to the frequency of the Gun's flicker. So I can predict, based on my theory, what the 4 corners of the divergent perception model will see in Gun's flicker. Specifically, here we have our people with hyperphantasia and aphantasia, the ones likely to have synesthesia. High sensory precision leads to stronger effects of Gun's flicker on the brain. The Gun's flicker decreases natural frequencies in these people to induce the experience of pseudo-hallucinations. Whether these are likely to be complex or simple will depend on mid-level priors, that is, consciously interpretative priors, mental imagery ability. So it's likely that the people with hyperphantasia will experience complex pseudo-hallucinations, but not the people with aphantasia. Whereas with already hallucination-prone individuals in the top left, who don't show sensory sensitivities, they won't be as affected by the Ganz flicker. But because they are naturally hallucination-prone, they will still be likely to see complex pseudo-hallucinations. And in the bottom left, you have your people with aphantasia, who are not naturally hallucination-prone or sensitive to sensory information, so they will not be as affected by the Ganz flicker, and they will continue to see nothing. And there you have an explanation of why people see different things or nothing at all in the Ganz flicker. In summary, the model could be used to explain why people are differently prone to complex and simple hallucinations. And the first thing I want to do is find out whether it can predict these experiences at the four corners of my model. Now we just need to test it.